The United States continues to escalate amid multiple conflicts, growing conflicts in the Middle East. This week, we saw the United States begin its retaliation for an attack on a military complex that includes a base just inside the Jordanian border with Syria. This comes to us from Voice of America. This is U.S. government-funded media. U.S. begins retaliation for deadly drone attack on its soldiers. And this was published February 2nd, 2024. And the article says the United States has begun carrying out airstrikes in the Middle East in retaliation for last Sunday's fatal drone attack on an American base in Jordan. The U.S. Central Command said its forces on Friday conducted airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds forces, and affiliated militia groups. U.S. military forces struck more than 85 targets with numerous aircraft to include long-range bombers flown from the United States. It also says U.S. President Joe Biden said the attacks were carried out at his direction. Our response began today. It will continue at times in places of our choosing. The United States does not seek conflict in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, but let all those who might seek to do us harm know this. If you harm an American, we will respond, said Biden in a Friday evening statement. But in reality, the U.S. regularly carries out retaliatory strikes like this, and they have no impact at all whatsoever on the fighting capacity of the groups that they are competing with in the region. And that is ultimately what this is. It is about nations and organizations in the region wanting sovereignty over their own territory and to determine their own fate, and the United States insisting on imposing its own primacy on the entire region. What's interesting about this Voice of America article, I may have missed it, but I attempted to read it from top to bottom, and I don't see any explanation as to why the United States is even in the region in the first place. And we often hear this claim made that the United States is in the region to fight ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State. Only the United States and its allies are the chief sponsors and underwriters of everything ISIS is doing in the region, along with Al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates and subsidiaries. These organizations are primarily aimed at fighting Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and in Syria. They were also fighting in an attempt to overthrow the government of Syria, which just not coincidentally is a primary objective of the United States in the region. And I want to point out that this is not me imagining this. This is the Western media itself over the years laying this out very clearly, that the United States, even before the conflict began in Syria in 2011, the United States was building up extremist groups in the region for precisely this purpose, to use as proxies against their enemies in the region, and also use them as a pretext for perpetual military occupation of the region. So this is an article that I have referenced many times before. This is from all the way back in 2007. It's by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker, titled "The Redirection: Is the Administration's New Policy Benefiting Our Enemies in the War on Terrorism?" And they're talking about the Bush administration, because that is how far back this goes, and this is how U.S. foreign policy is one singular agenda that moves forward regardless of who is in the White House or who controls Congress. Now, this is what the redirection, this article, said in 2007. It was a warning that turned out to be absolutely true. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. But ideologically, yes, they are hostile toward America, the West in general. But in reality, that does not matter. That is what they use to recruit the rank and file of these organizations. Ultimately, though, these organizations serve U.S. foreign policy. And from that point onward, that is exactly what the United States did. They bolstered these extremist organizations, stockpiled weapons, moved ammunition, trained them, directed them, preparing them for the 2011 so-called Arab Spring, this political destabilization of the entire region these armed groups then took advantage of and began taking up arms that they had been provided well in advance against the governments in Libya, in Yemen, and in Syria in particular. And we see how those conflicts have evolved since then. And then the United States portrayed all of this as spontaneous from 2011 onward. Eventually, it was revealed that they were moving billions and billions of dollars worth of arms and ammunition into the region to back these so-called moderate rebels. But then when it became obvious that the prevailing group on the battlefield, especially in Syria, but also in Libya beforehand, was Al-Qaeda subsidiaries like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Libya, obviously, and also the Al-Nusra Front in Syria. When it became obvious that they were the most prevalent organization on the battlefield, people started asking, how could this be? If we're giving billions of dollars to the so-called moderate rebels, how are these extremists able to displace them and dominate the battlefield and control the opposition? How is that possible? And we have articles like this from the New York Times. This is from 2017. This is when the narrative began falling apart. Behind the sudden death of a $1 billion secret CIA war in Syria. So it was a covert, dirty war to overthrow the Syrian government. And they used all of these narratives about a popular uprising, spontaneous, armed resistance. It was a CIA-sponsored dirty war all along. And planning began all the way back in 2007, as Seymour Hersh warned. This is what the New York Times article says. Once CIA-trained fighters crossed into Syria, CIA officers had difficulty controlling them. The fact that some of their CIA weapons ended up with Nusra Front fighters, this is Al-Qaeda in Syria essentially, and that some of the rebels joined the group, confirmed the fears of many in the Obama administration when the program began. But remember, the Bush administration knew this, and this was a deliberate aspect of U.S. foreign policy. So it was not a fear. It was always meant to unfold in this way. But this is how the New York Times and other Western media organizations spin all of this to make it look like it happened by accident. Although the Nusra Front was widely seen as an effective fighting force against Mr. Assad's troops, its Qaeda affiliation made it impossible for the Obama administration to provide direct support for the group. And they're essentially telling you they couldn't provide direct support, so they did it indirectly. And by indirectly, they just didn't tell the public. They portrayed it as going from moderate rebels, which never existed, and ending up accidentally in the hands of extremists when the U.S. was deliberately arming extremists from the very beginning. American intelligence officials estimate that the Nusra Front now has as many as 20,000 fighters in Syria, making it Al-Qaeda's largest affiliate. Unlike other Al-Qaeda affiliates, such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Nusra Front has long focused on battling the Syrian government rather than plotting terrorist attacks against the United States and Europe. So this is them trying to explain to you that if you don't believe the U.S. didn't deliberately arm al-Nusra, well, it's okay, because al-Nusra isn't really that bad anyway. They're good guys in this case. They're fighting the Syrian government just like the U.S. Is attempting to overthrow the Syrian government just like the U.S. is. But again, if you read news articles like this, they're telling you that al-Nusra has somehow become the predominant force on the battlefield, despite the U.S. pouring billions and billions of dollars into these so-called moderate rebels. How does that happen? Who is giving al-Nusra more money and more weapons if the U.S. is supplying all of this money, all of these weapons, all of this training to so-called moderate rebels? And the answer is there were no moderate rebels. They were arming the extremists on purpose from the very beginning. Exactly as Seymour Hersh warned in 2007, that is exactly what happened, and it's not entirely unlike how the US backed extremists in Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight the Soviet Union. They did the exact same thing from 2011 onward in Libya and Syria. If you look at a map of the region, you see Israel, Lebanon, Syria. Here is Jordan, and this is Iraq here, and then this is the northern part of Saudi Arabia. And if you zoom in where these three borders meet, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, if you zoom in, you're going to see this base right here, almost literally a stone's throw away from the border. This is the base that was attacked. This is not some base the US built in Jordan as part of some sort of security deal with Jordan. This is a base that was built specifically to support the US occupation and destabilization of neighboring Syria. That's the only reason it exists. It has no actual justified reason for existing, has nothing to do with defending the US or its allies in the region. It is there solely to destabilize Syria. And just to make it clear that that is why the US is in Syria, it is not in Syria to stop ISIS. It's actually there protecting ISIS and the remnants of organizations like al-Nusra, admittedly receiving weapons and equipment from the CIA as part of the US proxy war in Syria. We have a US Department of Defense official, Dana Stroll, who in 2019, in very explicit terms, laid out exactly why the US is maintaining its occupation of Syria, which, by the way, is illegal under international law. The US did not receive any sort of mandate from the United Nations. It was not invited into Syrian territory by the internationally recognized government of Syria. The US invaded and has been illegally occupying Syria ever since. They've been occupying this part of Syria east of the Euphrates River, and they have attempted to prevent Syrian forces from reestablishing control, preserving the territorial integrity of Syria as mandated under international law. And as a matter of fact, if you look at this map, this is from liveuamap.com. This is pro-Western, pro-NATO, but the map is very revealing. You see in yellow, these are the so-called Syrian democratic forces the US is using as proxies in eastern Syria. But in green, these are the areas that al-Nusra and other extremist groups are using as safe havens. And these are all areas controlled by either the United States or NATO member Turkey. So in the north, it's NATO member Turkey. And in the south, right here, right where that base was struck, this is where the remnants of Al-Qaeda, the various affiliates, this is where they are based and are protected by the US military. So we hear all of this talk about if the US leaves the Middle East, ISIS and Al-Qaeda win. No, if the US leaves, ISIS and Al-Qaeda will be eradicated from the region once and for all. They've been eradicated from all the major population centers in Syria by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. Let's listen to Dana Stroll in her 2019 talk at a CSIS. It's one of these government arms industry, corporate financier funded think tanks. This is her on what the US is achieving by maintaining its presence in Syria. Let's listen.
We argued in our recommendation section that taken as a whole, even though the United States, that there's limited appetite domestically here or on the Hill to match the level of resources or even diplomatic investment of the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, that the United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of US interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the US military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the US military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report. And then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the US military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were 3 other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East, is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. 2 is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And 3 was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So the US is in Syria to control food and energy, to prevent the economic recovery of Syria, to prevent reconstruction, to prevent Syria from moving on from this conflict. And they're doing this to maintain a point of leverage over the Syrian government and its allies, including Russia and Iran. And they're saying, if you don't do what we tell you, if you don't agree to regime change in Damascus, we will never give up these resources. Energy and food in eastern Syria will remain under our control indefinitely, and we will take every measure necessary to block reconstruction. Dana Stroll, in her capacity as a Department of Defense official, that is why she said the US is in Syria. So again, it's not the Syrian government imagining this is being done to them by the US. It is not critics of US foreign policy saying this. These are the people who are actually implementing US foreign policy, explaining that this is the reason they are in Syria. Now that was done in 2019, and if you listen to more of that talk, and the link to the full event is in the video description below. If you listen, you will hear Dana Stroll and others talking about how they need to continue doing this to prevent Syria from being accepted back by the international community, also accepted back by various Arab nations in the region. That was in 2019. Since then, this has all happened. Syria is normalizing its relations with the rest of the world. It has begun normalizing its relations with many nations in the Arab world. It is also beginning to normalize its relationship with NATO member Turkey. And this is all being facilitated by Russia, Iran, and also China to a fair degree. At that time, Iran and Saudi Arabia were still adversaries. The US was pitting them against each other. Today, they have reconciled their differences. They are working together on a whole host of issues, a growing list of issues, as a matter of fact. The US position now is more precarious than ever. They're carrying out these strikes in some sort of hope to project the illusion of strength in an attempt to maintain their grip over the region. But their grip is tenuous. It is fading. By this time next year, their position in the region will be even weaker. And what they're trying to do is plunge the whole region into some sort of conflict. They imagine they could then reassert control over the whole region in the middle of, just like they've done to Europe using this war they've provoked in Ukraine. against Russia. I want to talk about the military situation the US is in the Middle East, and I want to show you this article. This is from Popular Mechanics, which is very, I would say, suspiciously pro-Pentagon, almost as if it is a clearinghouse of Pentagon propaganda. And this article is titled, "A Drone Attack Devastated US Troops in Their Sleep. Is This the New Normal? The deadly strike on Tower 22 raises questions about the vulnerability of military bases." This was published January 29th, 2024. The article says, new reporting by the Wall Street Journal suggests that the source of the fatal gap in defenses, because they're trying to portray this attack as a lucky hit, that normally these type of attacks are unsuccessful, and this was just luck on the part of these militia groups. They say whether by design or sheer luck was the fact that the low-flying kamikaze drone approached at the same time a US surveillance drone was expected to land and thus was not engaged by air defenses. It also says Tower 22 is known to have been overwatched by an AN/TPS-75 PISA-type phased array radar, typically used by the US Air Force for flight control and early warning, and reportedly did have counter-drone defenses, but the nature of its kinetic defenses is unclear. Elements may include the automatically guided Guardian CRAM autocannon and Stinger missiles, either dismounted or mounted on Avenger Humvee systems. I've talked about these at length because they have been sending huge numbers of these systems to Ukraine, and they don't work. Stingers and CRAM are both counters against drones. CRAM can gun down incoming mortar rounds and artillery rockets as well, which are also common forms of attack. It's also likely that some counter UAS systems, like portable drone jammers or Coyote interceptor drones, were present at the base, but again, not used due to the failure to identify the approaching threat. Base was not covered by one of the US's few and highly expensive Patriot air defense missile batteries, which, due to their high price per shot, $3 to $4 million per missile, are not considered ideal counters to threats from cheaper drones. However, Patriots are preferred counters against ballistic missiles, which Iran has directly launched at US bases in the Middle East on at least 2 occasions, and they've gotten through past Patriot missile air and missile defenses. And there have been requests for Patriot coverage of US bases in Jordan. You see how close that base is to the Jordanian-Syrian border. Then the article says, overall, the Tower 22 attack reinforces the growing deadly threat posed by drones, even those deployed by non-state actors, and the need to systematically deploy anti-drone capabilities everywhere. To be fair, it's likely that such defenses were present at a base Tower 22's size, but failed to engage due to an identify friend or foe error. No defense is perfect, and given enough chances, attackers are likely to get lucky at least once. But the problem is, the US has these bases, they have been attacked, and both drones and missiles do get through. And they provided air and missile defense capabilities for Saudi Arabia during its multi-year war with Yemen, and Yemen was using drones and missiles that regularly got through and struck Saudi military targets and also oil production infrastructure. So the idea that this was just luck because they didn't identify the threat, this is irrelevant. The fact is, these bases are vulnerable because US air and missile defense capabilities are flawed, both in terms of quantity and quality. They are deficient. This Popular Mechanics article concludes this way. It says, broadly, the combination of the Israel-Hamas war and Iran and its proxies are frustrating the US's general desire to maintain a smaller, low-profile footprint in the Middle East and focus security efforts elsewhere. This forces the US to choose between unpleasant choices, either withdrawing forces to Iran and ISIS's benefit. That is problematic. I'll address that in just a moment. Reinforcing the US presence and aggressively retaliating at risk of larger war in the Middle East, or trying to sustain the present course, weathering constant attacks that through sheer frequency are bound to cause more casualties eventually. And I think if these militias or Iran or both were determined to cause more casualties, I think they would be able to. I think this is restraint on their part that we don't see more casualties. But this final paragraph, I'm focusing on this because I think it is a good summary of the overall narrative the Western media is trying to sell the public. This first part about if the US withdraws, it'll be to Iran and ISIS's benefit. And this is absolutely false. It will be to Iran's benefit, but not ISIS and not Al-Qaeda. Again, these two organizations, according to even the Western media, they exist and they have benefited from US foreign policy in the region. The US is not seriously attempting to get rid of these organizations. They are using them. Very clearly, they're using them. And if the US was no longer in the region to provide them safe haven, the nations in this region would eliminate them once and for all. Now, of course, Iran would benefit. Iran is a large, powerful nation that is actually located in the Middle East. And if the United States was not attempting to impose its will and influence on a region, again, on the other side of the planet from where the US actually exists, then Iran would be able to exert more influence, and so would all the other nations in the region. And they would be able to, as we already see, work together and move on out from under US primacy that has been projected onto the region for decades now. The idea of the US reinforcing its presence in the Middle East is problematic, again, because of the West's military industrial output. They do not have the ability to sustain their proxy war in Ukraine and also escalate exponentially in the Middle East. They simply do not have the number of weapons, equipment, and manpower to do it, and also maintain this growing menace they have poised at the edge of Chinese territory, and even in some ways within Chinese territory, if we talk about Taiwan. And then the idea of them trying to sustain the present course, weathering constant attacks, and then just through sheer frequency sustaining more casualties, this does seem to be their current strategy, because it's really the only thing they can do without just fully withdrawing, which they will try to prevent from doing until the very last minute. They want to project the illusion of strength, and they cannot do that if they withdraw from the Middle East. It is very important for us to understand that as the US escalates in the Middle East, as they retaliate, they're retaliating against nation states, militias, and against people who simply want the US out of their country, out of their territory. The US is illegally occupying multiple nations in the region. They're controlling, attempting to coerce other nations in the region. Even supposed US allies are pivoting away from the US, repairing ties with nations the US had pitted them against for decades, Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. The whole region is trying to move out from under US primacy, and they want the US out of the region for good. And the US is killing people to maintain their grip over the region. It's very important to understand that truth as this escalates and as the US attempts to put these narratives together, posing as somehow the victim, or somehow as the solution to instability and conflict in the region, when the US is the sole source of this conflict, this enduring conflict. Remember, the United States is the primary sponsor of Israeli military aggression in the region. It had underwritten Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen for many years, and it is the United States currently occupying Syria and Iraq, despite both nations demanding US forces to leave. And it's the United States, alongside its allies, including Israel, carrying out strikes all across the region. The region is at the precipice of war because the US refuses to leave territory that simply is not theirs to occupy. One final thought the United States, through airstrikes, through missile strikes, is not going to be able to degrade the military capabilities of even organizations like Ansar Allah or these militias in Iraq and Syria. They have been bombing and striking with missiles for years now. It has not degraded their military capabilities. They have been consistently growing stronger. And a large-scale conventional attack on Iran carried out by both the US and Israel would not significantly set back Iran. So the fear is the temptation to use nuclear weapons may overrule what would otherwise necessitate a full US withdrawal from the region, because what they're doing right now is simply unsustainable. That is something to keep in mind and to watch out for as the US flails and lashes out in the Middle East as their supremacy is challenged and is being incrementally pushed out of the region. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check out the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much, whether it's one-time donations or donations month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there. All of that is greatly appreciated. I could not do this work without that support. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.